Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, it almost didn't happen. The Americans were about to block her nomination. In fact, the Americans did block it under the Trump administration, even after Mr. Trump was told that Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala was the candidate who commanded the most support. But the Trump administration said no. The WTO, of course, has a history of trying to make these appointments by consensus, so the organization's membership decided to put the whole process on hold, essentially while they were waiting for the outcome of the US election. And as we well know, President Trump lost office and President Biden's regime decided to remove the blockage and made the decision to come out in support of Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. And she was duly appointed on Monday, and the rest is history. Well, insofar as it would have been possible to intercede with Donald Trump on behalf of Dr. Okonjo-Iweala and Africa, my next guest would have been leading that charge. Stephen Hayes, President and CEO Emeritus of the Corporate Council for Africa, led the council for 17 years and helped to grow its membership from 86 to more than 200, with its members now representing 85% of US private investment in Africa. And Stephen Hayes joins me now online from Washington. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for joining us. We appreciate your presence. President Trump wasn't a big fan of the World Trade Organization, nor was he a big fan of the World Health Organization, for that matter. And he reflected the view of some who believe that these institutions don't contribute that much anymore. Where do you stand on that?
Well, first, I wasn't a big fan of President Trump, so his views don't necessarily move me. I think there needs to be some reform in WTO, perhaps the World Health Organization, but I think both bodies are far more important and remaining rather than disappearing. And I think that particularly the World Health Organization is absolutely vital, especially now, but even in what we might call normal times. The World Trade Organization, I think, needs to look at a number of reforms, and I'm very, very happy about the new leader of the World Trade Organization. She was very supportive of my work, and I thought she did an excellent job in Nigeria as well. So I think it's an excellent and long overdue position and posting.
And would you say that skepticism around the WTO and the WHO existed in the US long before Donald Trump, and he simply sharpened that suspicion and skepticism, and that's one of the big challenges that Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is going to face, this suspicion of globalization and global free trade?
Well, I think that's a very perceptive statement on your part. It's certainly there's a suspicion of globalization, and globalization has helped a lot of people. It's helped the global economic process, but it's also, I think, has a strong downside. And that is that it has the danger of leaving a lot of people behind. The corporate sector, I think, has to be far more responsible in the future. Well, actually, they need to be far more responsible in the present as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and I think she has a lot of challenges ahead of her.
And of course, it's not just the US, is it? I mean, countries like China, even though they promote free trade at times, you know, they're also talking about a policy called dual circulation, which is all about creating more self-sufficiency. And that's a policy that's been accelerated by COVID, which has made more countries look inward.
Well, I think so. I think that certainly just about all countries are now looking more inward, and there's a certain degree of, I think, strength in introspection. It's something that we haven't done a lot of in our history, I'm afraid. I also think that we promote free trade at times. And so I think that all the nations need to be far more introspective, particularly how they help their own citizens and their workforce. And I think that's a big reason for the divide, not simply in the United States, but the growing divide in most countries, it seems, around the world. How do we bring in the worker? How do we bring in the poor more into the economy? Because clearly, I think a major issue is that there's been a strong divide between the rich and the poor, and in fact, the wealth is being accumulated more and more at the top and leaving a greater part of the population behind. So I think that's something that we really have to address, and I think that's one of the great global challenges, as well as the current health challenge as well.
And of course, in the course of your work in Africa, and obviously we're going to talk about this a lot more in the next section, you would have, perhaps more so than a lot of other people, would have come across the competition between the US and China and perhaps even Europe in Africa. And there is that US-China relationship, which is a complicated one, made more so by President Trump. And President Biden may not in fact be that different in that area, because I understand there is bipartisan support in the US for a harder line on China and a harder line on trade.
I spent a lot before CCA, the Corporate Council on Africa. I spent a lot of time in China as well. So I have some empathy with what the Chinese have gone through, progressing particularly from almost nothing to a very, very powerful nation. I think President Trump pinned in President Biden, unfortunately, and that he now has to also show a strong front to China, as well as lest he be quickly accused of being pro-China, weak, and so forth. I think you're absolutely right that the relationship between the United States and China is extremely complex. I think there are areas where we should be cooperating more, and I think there's areas where, frankly, I think we should be looking at how, again, coming back to how corporations have made it far more difficult as well in terms of moving workforces. So I think that it's a complex issue. It's not going to be solved right away. I think President Biden will have to show that he is strong on working for changes in US-China policy, as well as changes in China. And that's going to be very, very difficult to dictate or seemingly to dictate outside of China. So I think that there's got to be, in that regard, there has to be far greater communication between China and the US. There was almost none for 4 years. And so I think that the key will be very subtly communicating more effectively. I think meetings between US and China should happen more frequently. And I think also, again, we're going to look at the growing gap between the very, very rich and the rest of the people in any country, including China as well as the United States.
And not to keep banging on about US and China, but you can see the relationship between that to Africa, and we're going to get to Africa eventually. But would it be fair to say that as long as you've got these two giant countries, the US and China, fighting over the rules of trade, it's going to be much more difficult for an institution like the World Trade Organization to have a say?
I think that's accurate. There's not too much more I would say on that. That's a very, very clear statement, and I think it's a very accurate statement by you. I think that it's going to be far more difficult for the WTO to have a role, but it's also with I guess the president Okonjo-Iweala, it's going to be she's going to have a far greater role at the same time. She can play a more balancing role, although in balance she may be criticized by both sides, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It means you're doing your job if nobody's happy. But in any case, I think that the role of the WTO is going to evolve as well. We hope that it will evolve into a more positive force. I don't mean that it was negative in the past, but a more active and I guess wiser force in terms of bringing economic equality for all.
Well, let's move things a little bit closer to your specific area of expertise, which is Africa. Do you think globalization has been good for Africa?
I think I think it hasn't been bad per se, in the sense that it has created more opportunities in Africa. I think globalization could have been better for Africa. In fact, I think it hasn't done enough. There needs to be more development of economies, and you can't just do that alone. I think in country by country, particularly in Africa. And so I think there needs to be, again, not simply globalization, but a more harmonization of economies that work together more, I guess, more effectively. Uh, we talk about in Africa economies working together, the Confederation of Trade Act and so forth, the Continental Trade Act. But again, there's got to be greater, a more effective communication and a more effective and sincere commitment to working together throughout the continent. As far as China goes, I think that certainly in the beginning, and I would say still now, that the role that China has played in the development of Africa has been overall positive. I would say that, say the same for the United States. I think there are areas that, and certainly Europe, there are areas where I would say hasn't been particularly positive. But there's also the fact is that China has made the rest of the world much more aware of Africa, whether we like it or not. They've also brought some development to Africa that we should have been doing before. Frankly, we should have been building rail lines before. We should have been doing much more with Africa before, and it should have taken a greater wisdom rather than the fear of China to get us moving.
Now, those are really very interesting points you've made there. Really very insightful, and kind of gives a different sort of analysis to the current sort of word, if you like, on this globalization that's emerging from the United States. And just to say that we're going to come back to you in a minute, and we'll talk a little bit more about your organization that you presided over for 17 years, the Corporate Council on Africa. But just a quick word before we take a break. Critics saying the WTO is an organization in crisis, and quite a lot of people sending in messages saying that this is likely to be a poison chalice for Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. We'll have to see how that goes. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Stephen Hayes, President and CEO Emeritus of the Corporate Council on Africa. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegulu. Now, my guest, Stephen Hayes, is President Emeritus of the Corporate Council on Africa, and his is a well-known name among business circles in the US and Africa. Mr. Hayes marked the significant landmark in 2016 of being the longest-serving president and CEO of the council. People who know him say he did a great job of expanding the membership of the council and helped to attract billions of dollars worth of US investment into Africa. In appreciation of his efforts, his service has been recognized with numerous awards, including the Ron Brown Award for International Leadership, which is the highest award that's given by the US Department of Commerce. He's also a winner of the annual award of the Africa Chamber of Commerce of the USA. And just to give you an idea of how important this award is, the previous recipient was Barack Obama.
If you're going to invest, if you're going to find financing, you're probably going to have to go to China, as some of our companies have, or you're going to go to Europe to get financing at higher rates. So that's another issue that is not simply an Africa issue, it's an American issue as well. It's a major impediment. So anyway, in a nutshell, the slowdown is not necessarily a crisis, but merely, I think, in historical terms, especially given infrastructure development, predictable on Africa. I don't think it's something to worry about as much as seeing it as an opportunity, especially in infrastructure, especially in power development, the hotel industry, and so forth. By the way, when we took over the Africa Travel Association, we automatically got their membership also, which includes Marriott, Hilton, Belton, Starwood, Delta, Starwood, several others. So the hotel industry is now really starting to gear up towards, and with the hotel industry, then there's the food industry, there's the infrastructure that has to be built around that. You have to at least 25,000 miles of coastline.
Stephen Hayes there doing his work, and of course he is President Emeritus now of the Corporate Council on Africa, and he's still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. So the Corporate Council on Africa, of which you are President Emeritus, represents about 85% of US private investment in Africa. That is pretty significant. Tell us more about the council.
Well, it is significant. I'm not sure what that percentage is now. It's been 4 years since I left the council, and probably stayed on too long. Frankly, 17 years made me think that there probably should be term limits for nonprofit organizations as well. But the Corporate Council on Africa was developed to build the bridge on economics between the U.S. and Africa. And inevitably, when that happens, you also build a bridge on politics. So there are things that, looking back, I wish I had done better. There are also a lot of things that I'm proud of as well. But it's an important organization. And I would say it's invaluable because there isn't an organization in the U.S. quite like it. It's a little different from, say, a Chamber of Commerce. In fact, I'd say significantly different in that it also looks at least under my regime, it looks at how do we make a difference, not simply for the lives and businesses, but how do we make a difference in the lives of the Africans as well as the Americans in terms of building that relationship. To me, and everything that I've tried to do in my life, some more successful than other times, is that it's about relationship, because that's ultimately what we have in this life. So what I've tried to do is use the corporate structure to build relationships, not simply for the dollars, which of course you always are accused of, but also to build the relationship between countries. And when you talk about building relationships between countries, you inevitably have to talk about building the relationship between the individuals, because the individuals run the countries. So that's probably a more esoteric description of what I tried to do at the Corporate Council on Africa. But it does have most of the major corporations that do invest in Africa. It is also open to corporate. It is still open to corporate members from Africa, and that's what I tried to do is open and build those bridges.
Well, absolutely. I was looking at your membership list, and it includes some of the biggest multinationals in the world, including ExxonMobil, Chevron, Ethiopia Airlines, the Dangote Group, which is Nigerian, Pfizer, Zenith Bank, which is Nigerian, and a whole host of of others. And of course, you yourself, President and CEO of the Council for 17 years. And I expect that in that time, your knowledge of Africa would have deepened and your network of relations across the continent would have widened considerably. I mean, tell us about that and how at the outset you came to forge a relationship with Africans in the first place.
No, that's a longer story, but I would say yes. If my knowledge of Africa hadn't deepened in 17 years, it would have been a pretty stupid man at the head, and probably a even more foolish board of directors for keeping me in place. But it's a continent that I've come, like a lot of people have when they work with Africa, come to love and appreciate. And so it's probably been the most valuable years of my life. I've spent almost my entire adult life in international, and particularly in the international not-for-profit sector. Spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe and also building the bridges between the U.S. and the old Soviet Union before the change of that era. Spent some time in China as well as Vietnam, and I'm particularly proud of having brought the first delegation of Vietnamese leaders to the United States since the end of the Vietnam War. So it seems almost natural that each decade was a different part of the world, and I was recruited, frankly, to apply for the job at the Corporate Council. I admit that I didn't know a lot about Africa, although I had made several trips to Africa and had worked with UNCTAD 4 in Nairobi as well. So I wasn't naive to Africa, but it really was the time of spending time at the Corporate Council which really built my deep affection for Africa. Whether others felt the same towards me as a result of that, who knows? But nevertheless, it's been an important process for me as well.
And I know you do the Corporate Council on Africa does a lot of these high-level conferences, things like the U.S.-Africa Business Summit. I saw that you brought the Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta into a high-level dialogue recently. What about Nigeria? What have you been doing here in that sort of business regard?
I'm glad you asked. It's that my work with Nigeria has been affected, like everybody else's work, by COVID. But I had been working particularly in the area as a consultant on healthcare, and was working with the Nigerian company Thompson & Grace to build a hospital in Akwabam. But COVID has stepped in on that in a tragic way, as the leader of that process in Nigeria, in Akwabam, died of COVID just recently. So that puts that on hold, but I think that it was the work on building healthcare is important throughout Nigeria, and it was giving me an opportunity to really work on a specific project. Where that stands now, I don't know, but it's a country that I think needs to really put a lot of emphasis on healthcare. And I would have said that, in fact, was saying that long before COVID. I think it's a growth area as far as the economy. It's also a growth area in terms of necessity. So I think that that's one of the areas that really could be of great benefit to Nigeria, as well as a great benefit to the economy of Nigeria, as well as to those who are investing in Nigeria.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much indeed. You might not have seen it, but we're just looking at a photograph of you shaking hands with President Buhari. And I want to say, Stephen Hayes, President Emeritus of the Corporate Council on Africa, it's been a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, Lagos, and Washington, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.